Hello and welcome everyone to the second event in our series of roundtables on technology and criminal justice. My name is Chris Ferris and I'm a legal and policy officer at Fair Trials based in London. Today's event is going to be on criminal justice by algorithm, specifically predictive policing, the use of algorithms to predict, profile and assess people pre-arrest, which often leads to police surveillance, harassment and ultimately arrest, as well as non-criminal sanctions such as losing access to essential services like housing, education, and welfare. Next month, we will be focusing on the other side, the use of these systems in pretrial detention, sentencing, and probation. Just to go over some functional details, after we've heard from our three speakers, we will open up to questions, finishing at 5:30. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. We may also do some quick polls of the participants on the issues that arise, so please have a look out for those as well. I'm going to give an outline to predictive policing before we hear from our speakers, as it's a topic which may be new to some of you here. So predictive policing is the generalized term used to refer to data-based and analytical systems, often machine learning algorithms or other automated decision-making systems, which are used by police, law enforcement and other agencies to predict the likelihood of crime in a certain place or the likelihood that an individual or individuals will commit crime in future. These predictive profiling and risk assessment systems, which purport to predict whether people will commit crime or their risk of committing crime before they have actually done so, based on their history and backgrounds and other supposedly relevant factors, engage and infringe clearly fundamental rights, not least the presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial, privacy and data protection rights. There are fundamental issues with the theory and models underpinning these predictive and profiling systems. In the criminal justice system, most predictive algorithmic systems which are used are statistical models made up of data, criminal justice data. This data is ultimately representative of the structural biases and inequalities in society which the data represents, and which is always comprehensively lacking in the kind of necessary detail that would be needed to make truly accurate predictions or decisions. Structural racism and other forms of discrimination are a fundamental reality in policing and criminal justice across Europe. Black people, people of color, and Roma are overrepresented in criminal justice systems and police records as a result of over-policing and increased attention due to structural and societal discrimination. These biases are reflected in that criminal justice data. Criminal justice data does not represent an accurate record of criminality, but merely a record of law enforcement or policing, a record of the crimes, locations, and groups that are policed within society, rather than the actual occurrence of crime. As the data used to build and populate these predictive and profiling systems is mostly or entirely from within criminal justice, this data does not represent the true crime as it occurs in these countries. The data represents those social inequalities and those discriminatory policing patterns, and its use in these predictive systems merely results in a reinforcement and re-entrenchment of those inequalities and discrimination in the outcomes of these predictive systems. So clearly, these systems embedded with such biases can expand and entrench those biases in society and in the data used in these systems. Another serious issue is the impact these systems have on the presumption of innocence. The right to be presumed innocent in criminal proceedings is a basic human right, part of the right to a fair trial. But predictive systems which make assumptions, judgments, and ultimately stereotype people completely undermine this right. These systems generate reasonable suspicion for police and law enforcement. They profile people as suspects, and they ultimately are giving police justification for increased surveillance, intervention, and even arrest. These systems are changing the way criminal justice works, undermining the concepts and formal ideas around criminal justice, and therefore also what legal protections and safeguards there are in place to protect people's rights and freedoms. So to our first speaker, Dr. Patrick Williams is a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. He undertakes research and publishes in the area of race and ethnicity, with a particular focus on racial disparity, disproportionality, and differential treatment within the criminal justice system. He is a recent co-author of Data-Driven Policing, the hardwiring of discriminatory policing practices across Europe, and also Being Matrixed, the over-policing of gang suspects in London, on behalf of the NGO based in London, Stopwatch. Patrick, take it away.
Good evening or good afternoon or early evening. Thank you, Griff, for that introduction. And also thank you for affording me the opportunity to undertake this presentation, which is going to draw on a couple of pieces of work which I've been involved with recently. Firstly, the question of data-driven policing, which was undertaken with Very Kind on behalf of ENAR, European Network Against Racism, and also the piece of work you just made reference to, which was Being Matrixed, which focused on the police, the interviews, a number of in-depth interviews with individuals who had been, who were suspected of being gang members in London. What I would like to do is use a couple of slides. I know it's a short presentation or a short input, but I think it'd be really useful in terms of presenting some of the ideas I will be speaking to. But from the outset, I'd like to start with a quote here, a quotation. I've been branded as a gang member because I've lived in the area of gang crime and drugs and have associated with people who have been involved in certain activities. I think that's unfair, and not just in my situation. It's in every situation. People shouldn't be branded because of their surroundings, their religion, or what they do. I should be able to have friends that may do bad things, but the police should know or be able to understand that I am not involved in that and separate it. They should be able to know that there are certain Muslims who try to kill in the name of Allah, but there are Muslims who believe that is wrong and go against all of that. It's two separate things. And that's why all of this gang branding and all of that shit is mad. That's why the police don't understand. And that is what they need to understand. That was a quote taken from Stephen, who contributed to the Being Matrixed study. And in essence, what Stephen begins to speak to is his encounters with the police whilst living in London. What's also interesting is the language of branding and how that plays into Stephen's understanding of his experiences of being policed. The notion that, and as other individuals have reported, that the police think they know me became a recurring term in the research, and was something that we were particularly minded to begin to think about. What is it that these young men meant when they said the police think they know me? And I guess it's within that context that I want to begin to speak about this notion of suspicion and how suspicion sits at the heart of how people experience policing and law enforcement practices across Europe. Within the report produced by myself and Eric, we found that notions of over-policing are consistent across many different European countries. Whether this was sub-Saharan individuals, individuals of sub-Saharan background or South Asian backgrounds, the Roma community, they consistently reported to the Fundamental Rights Agency in 2018 that they were over-policed and were viewed with suspicion. For some individuals, they couldn't articulate or explain what the factors were that were driving their significant episodes of stop and search. However, in the work that we engage in, we begin to attempt to conceptualize some of this thinking. However, what is important is to recognize the reality that over-policing and stop and search practices are a feature of being black and brown people across Europe. And it's this notion of being viewed with suspicion that we believe is at the heart of some of these ideas, and the notion of how suspicion begins to transpose itself into notions of riskiness. So whilst I have a number of slides, and if individuals want to share the slides later, I'm happy to do that. But in essence, from the outset, there's a question of racialization, that process of attributing negative characteristics to a group based on their belonging to a specific ethnic group. And it's the racialization of particular groups, which we believe is a starting point in terms of trying to understand the notion of suspicion. But how that suspicion then leads to, and is often informed by the criminalization of particular groups and individuals. That process whereby the police and other law enforcement agencies begin to infer a criminality on those individuals who are seen as not belonging, those individuals who are presented and constructed as outsiders. Increasingly, therefore, it's such groups across Europe who begin to be viewed with a suspicion of criminality and in turn become perceived as risk to be managed. From this position, therefore, I want to be clear. To be stopped and searched, therefore, is not a random or a chance encounter. I would argue that to be stopped and searched is a deliberate political and police response to the racialised construction of particular groups and communities as risky and as crime problems to be managed. Within that context, therefore, it's unsurprising that policing will disproportionately target black and brown people in an imagined white Europe. But from within our report, and it's a point that I think is important to make here, is that we begin to see, and in our report we focus on the encroachment of technology into police and law enforcement practices. And in essence, what we can see is the seduction of tech as a way of presenting a number of solutions to a series of crime problems across Europe. What we do know about policing practice within the UK and across Europe, for example, is that detection rates can be seen as extremely low. Policing practice, therefore, can be presented as being ineffective in responding to those predominant crime problems that are presented in the media on a regular basis. And therein lies the seduction of tech. The appeal to respond to a series of crime problems and offering solutions to police and law enforcement agencies as a way of responding to those perceived risk and wider problems. However, we need to be clear that tech is not neutral. And as Griff just referenced, it's a bureaucratic reflection of established policing practices. Within that regard, therefore, if we are using police data as a way of informing or training the tech, then in essence what we have is biased data in, which produces biased data out. In essence, to incorporate and utilize racialized data to train such technologies and such systems, particularly with reference to artificial intelligence, will result in the policing of those very same communities who've been subjected to over-policing. It's within that context, therefore, that we begin to refer to the notion of data harms. And I know Fiki may also speak to this notion of data harms, where individuals and particular groups and communities become subject to policing because the very same technology and those policing practices infer that is where the crime problem exists. I guess for us, the centrality of risk, therefore, and notions of risk within what is an imagined white Europe as a way of protecting the public means that, in essence, what we will continue to see is the over-policing of particular groups and communities across Europe. And I guess in terms of the work that I've been involved with, I want to pay particular attention to what I would argue is a problematic construct of the gang. And in essence, and this is a terrible table, it's one that often can turn many individuals off. But in essence, I want to try and demonstrate how increasingly we're beginning to quantify notions of suspicion. So what you can see is what individuals may refer to as a spider diagram. It's an illustration of social network analysis. And in essence, all those dots that we can see on the screen are representative of different individuals. These nodes, therefore, represent different groups and people. Now, this social network analysis is based on data taken from Greater Manchester Police, where I live in Greater Manchester. And what the 5 red circles point towards are 5 individuals who the police have identified as gang members, however defined. Now, I've done a number of different research projects in relation to gangs in Manchester, and I want to point out at this point that to this date, there is still no offence of being involved in a gang. However, what we know is that the police have the details of these 5 individuals from which to give to academics and tech individuals as a way of beginning to build a picture of where the crime problem exists. I also want to elaborate on this chart just for a little longer, because in essence, what we see in those nodes, those dots, is that the police have gathered the information and hold the intelligence information on a range of individuals who they see as related to or connected to those 5 gang members. In essence, we can see the information plotted on a chart of 137 different individuals. What's interesting within this academic paper written by Gunnell and colleagues is that 84% of those people on this chart, 115 people, are not thought to have criminal ties. They are related to those 5 gang members through family, romance, or friendship links. What strikes me here is, one, how the police have the information on these non-criminal individuals as a way of building this social network analysis, and more importantly, to be connected with those individuals who are seen as risky also serves that those individuals will also become the foci for police attention. They are connected, and therefore, in essence, what we do is quantify their riskiness into this social network analysis. But also to develop on this, it leads me to begin to reflect on a piece of research I was involved with on behalf of Stopwatch in 2018. And this was in relation to the gangs violent matrix, which was owned by, which was developed in London by the Metropolitan Police. Now, to be matrixed for the purposes of our research was to be registered to a police gang database or be suspected of being involved or associated or at risk of gangs. It's important to flag out, and sometimes it sounds really strange to say this, to be registered to a gang's database does not mean you are a gang member. In essence, an individual who is a victim of violence may also be registered to a gang's database. Or these are individuals, again, referring back to the previous slide, individuals who may be associated to individuals who the police define as being gang involved. In essence, what we begin to see in this piece of work, and what we sought to do, was undertake interviews with people who were thought to be suspected of being gang members. As of the 31st of March, what we identified was on this gang violent matrix was that there were just over 2,500 individuals who were registered to this gang's database. 43% of these individuals were also in custody. Now, what we find in the gangs violent matrix is the use of a classification system, and it's a violence classification system. In essence, we seek to try and predict those individuals who may be at risk of violence. So individuals are flagged either red, amber, and green. For our purposes, what we found in the most recent figures, or the figures anyway, at the end of March prior to lockdown, were that 5% were flagged as being red, at high risk of involvement in gangs or high risk of violence or perpetrating violence. I would also hazard a guess that the vast majority of these individuals would also be in custody. Then 29% were flagged as being amber, but the majority, almost 2/3 of these individuals, were flagged as green, of low risk. However, their details are still retained on that database. Remarkably, 90% of these individuals are from a minority ethnic group, and 79%, just approximately 80%, were flagged as from an Afro-Caribbean background. Again, 3/4 of those individuals on this database were aged under 25 years. However, rather than just simply being registered to a database, and it's always interesting to hear the arguments and the defense of gangs databases, the assumption is that these individuals' details simply reside on these databases, and as such, this does not lead to increased encounters. However, from our research, what became fairly evident extremely quickly was that these individuals will be policed with impunity. They are subject to stop, search, and harassed by the police. As Stephen remarked at the beginning of this input, they are subjected to the labelling effects of being branded as gang members. But what these individuals also spoke to of these intrusive intelligence gathering processes. Individuals were excluded from school because they were at risk, because they were thought to be gang members and at risk to other pupils. One individual disclosed that they were not allowed to go to a pupil referral unit because the police said there were other gang members within that space. In essence, the entitlement to education was taken away from this individual. Other young people spoke about the Achilles heel that Amnesty International speak to, where in essence, pressure is placed on a family to move out of their home and their geographical area because the police deem this will be safer for the family. We see the use of social services as strategies as a way of trying to coerce compliance within these families. We in essence begin to see the multi-agency or the breach of data protection and multi-agency arrangements where individuals, and I use this language deliberately, the construction of a hostile environment around particular groups and individuals and within particular communities, all under the guise of protecting the public and all under the guise of attempting to try and respond to this notion of violence. It's important for me to tease out that there is often for me a clear tension between the conflation of violence and the constructions of gangs. Violence doesn't discriminate. It's picked up and can be identified irrespective of race, gender, sexuality, class, etc. So in essence, that we focus attention in this particular group and predominantly minority ethnic people is evidence of the racialization of crime on particular groups and individuals. But this is not just particular to London and England and Wales. Across Europe, we see similar language emerging around the notion of gangs. So in Spain, we see strategies being developed where we seek to increase intelligence on gangs through mapping and monitoring, trying to develop strategies as a way of responding to gang issues. And equally in Spain, we see reference to engaging contact with teachers and parents and young people. The multi-agency arrangements being put in place as a way of trying to manage these individuals who are perceived as risky. In France, we had the gang shutdown strategy. Again, notions and strategies which call for increased intelligence gathering on particular groups and individuals who are thought to pose a risk or be at greater risk of involvement in violent offending. Again, with the conflation of violence with gangs, as if somehow gangs are the only explanation for violence across societies in Europe. Similarly, we have these multi-agency gang arrangements across Denmark and Sweden. The notion that numbers of minority groups who are being made subject to these gang intervention approaches. In essence, what we can read when we begin to see the gang is a racialization of crime which attributes and targets young black and brown individuals, and within the UK context, specifically young black men. But going back to Andrew, it was weird, man. I was being stopped and searched all the time. It was weird, man. I was being stopped and searched all the time to the point where it became a joke. It was a normal thing like putting your clothes on. You knew you were getting stopped and searched. There were all times, I remember one time, and Andrew laughs in the interview, I got stopped 3 times in a day. I can't remember if they say you've been stopped twice in the same day or something like that, or 3 times a day. You don't have to get stopped for the 3rd time. But it didn't happen. I was still getting searched. It became so normal. It felt like I knew what was going on. Everyone around me was getting stopped and searched daily. In fact, there was no one around me that wasn't, in a sense. So I just thought, yeah, it's just a thing where they're just stopping young black kids. For Paul, they think they know me. They don't know me. That's what these police officers go off. They think they know you because they see things on paper, intelligence, and they think they can make a judgment. It's like, no, you can't search me. I'm not going to bow down to you because you found out I've been in trouble with the police. I guess in conclusion, I want to draw from I just want to conclude from the findings from the data-driven report, which again was written last year. And in essence, racialized policing and ethnic profiling is an everyday experience for minority ethnic people, groups and communities across Europe. The emotional impact is painful. It's driving mistrust of the police and wider law enforcement agencies and disrupts notions of belonging and citizenship. The introduction of new technology by police forces in recent years has raised significant questions around the extent to which these tools are further entrenching, and I would argue hardwiring, racial discrimination and criminal injustice. As we considered throughout our report, technology is not neutral or necessarily scientifically objective, and therefore, unless guarded against, it will exacerbate racial, ethnic and religious disparities in European justice systems. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That's a perfect description of how discriminatory policing strategies and conceptions of criminality, such as the gang, results in certain demographics being overrepresented on police records, and through these same databases and systems results in those same people being subjected to continued over-policing. Next, we're going to hear some more examples of predictive systems. So Fieke Jansen is a PhD candidate at the Data Justice Lab as part of the ERC-funded Data Justice project. She looked at the effect of data on society. Her research focuses on the impact of implementing data-driven decision-making in European police forces. Prior to this, Fieke worked at Tactical Tech and HEVOS on data privacy and digital security programs, and led a knowledge program on the intersection of youth, technology, and activism. Fieke.
Hi, thanks. Wait, I also have some slides. I'll share. It's always hard to follow up on Patrick. That was really great. So Griff asked me to talk about predictive policing in the Netherlands, and specifically about sort of two types of programs that are currently running, where one focuses on sort of location policing. Many people have seen these images maybe in Minority Reports, where a city is like a grid and you see like they're color coded to sort of drive police in one direction. And the other one is more towards risk scoring, and then the risk scoring of an individual, and the gang matrix is a version of this predictive policing. And I'll talk about 3 Dutch use cases on this. So first I'll go into location policing, and just sort of, I'll start both by saying off that these are not like one-off systems. This is just like a snapshot of what's happening in Europe. So there's different predictive policing systems on the location in the UK that have been tested and halted. But also in Germany, there's several versions of them. And in Italy, they're basically all across Europe, and they all are a little bit different, but in reality, they pretty much do the same thing. But I do feel that it's quite important to look into the systems to sort of see what is it exactly that they're basing their decisions on and how it's being used. So for this, I'll talk about the crime anticipation system, which is a predictive policing tool that was developed by the police of Amsterdam to predict where in the near future, which location in Amsterdam high impact crime or acquisitive crime is most likely to happen. And this is basically a snapshot of a presentation of CAS, how they refer to it, which you see Amsterdam, and it's like broken down into smaller parts. Red is where it's most likely high impact crime is going to happen. So when they started working on CAS, I think it's a little bit different than most of the American off-the-shelf projects you can buy. Because I think what they first did was they made a map of Amsterdam that they broke down in small squares of 125 meters by 125 meters. And they plotted sort of, you have to get a lay of the land. So they plotted a lot of municipal data on it. So the locations of shops, of highways, sort of things that are quite steady over time. And with shops, it's like supermarkets, but also jewelries and other places. And then, so this was sort of the static element of CAS, and sort of the more real-time element is then crunched on the basis of data. And they do it on 3 main types of data. So location-specific characteristics that I will go into. Crime history, so the crime history that happened before in those locations. And then specifically also focusing on the 2 weeks before. And sort of these location specific characteristics, they usually have nothing to do with crime. So CAS takes the Bureau of Statistics of the Netherlands, and they take the demographic data that they have on the city. And they sort of look at, as you can see, the number of inhabitants, but also sort of the composition of the household, whether there's like a migration background. This variable was removed in 2017. But there's also things like income of the household, how many people are in it, do they receive social benefits, what type of social benefits, things like this. So they actually use this data to sort of make a real-time indication of where crime is happening. And sort of they layer it with the crime history. So they look at police records that show reports of the number of burglaries and robberies at specific places. So they have like the last 2 weeks, the 2 weeks before that, the last 4 weeks. So it's an entire database. And it's not just to the location, but also sort of what happens in the neighboring squares. So these 125 meters by 125 meters. And then they also take into account things like seasons, where they say like there's going to be more burglaries when it's dark outside, so when winter is coming, or in the summer holidays when people are away and we know that sort of the houses are empty. So they actually take quite a lot of variables into account, which is not that normal for predictive policing systems. But the problem is like actually this tool has been running already for a few years now, and they first tested it in Amsterdam, and they have now sort of rolled it out over the entire country, because the Netherlands is different than the UK, where it's like we have one national police instead of like distinct police forces. And sort of one of the arguments is that it's actually, is it predicting the location of crime, or is it just predicting where arrests will happen? Because if you say something will happen in a specific location, and the theory is that there will be more police presence, there will be more likelihood that an arrest will happen. But the thing is, like, there hasn't been any proven correlation between the prediction of crime and the reduction of crime. So we haven't seen any tests or studies that actually indicate that sort of using predictive systems will reduce the amount of crime in the streets. There has, like, talking to people who have been working with CAS, there's been a lot of reluctance from officers on the street to use it, because they don't believe like a system like this can actually tell them how to police better, especially not the local police officers or the neighborhood police officers, what we call them here. And then I stumbled upon this really interesting fact that actually in the Netherlands and Belgium, like senior police officers were saying that these systems actually don't work because the crime rates are too low. So you cannot predict in real time where something will happen. And as such, CAS became more of a support tool that every 2 weeks they sort of roll out one of these maps. And it's one of the many things that a chief of police sort of takes into account when directing resources about where people are going to happen. And yet, even though we know that the crime rates are too low, they still continue to invest in it and deploy it across the country. And for me, this is quite interesting, because like, if we sort of like, if it doesn't work, what are the reasons why police keep on investing in it? And I think this is like, I think these are the questions we have to try to uncover. But maybe what's most, I think, concerning about this tool is that it mixes demographic data with police data for prediction and actually for police use. So even if the use is like minimal, we cannot tell like where it's going to happen in the future. And do we really want them to use demographic data about sort of migration backgrounds of people, income levels, all of this stuff, which is not in police databases, but has been collected for other purposes, to be using for predictive purposes of police? And then I'll quickly go into the second type of predictive policing programs that we have in the Netherlands. And this is to predict the perpetrator or a victim of a specific crime. Patrick already went into this a bit with the gang matrix. And as you can see, these are also not new programs. This is also a snapshot of programs that are happening in Europe. Some are active, some are in development, some are temporarily suspended. But there is a lot of like unknowns about them. And they sort of, these range usually larger crime areas. So it's not only high impact crime, but it also looks, for instance, in Germany, they have terrorism. It looks into escalation of violence, gangs, a wide range of things. In the Netherlands, they primarily still look at sort of high impact crime. And so I'll talk about two programs, but I just want to share this pyramid of increasing complexity. So this is the logic behind these risk scoring programs in the Netherlands from the police perspective. So they say there's a pyramid of increasing complexity with criminality. So if you look at society, most of the people in society hardly ever interact with police, and there's actually no intervention needed from the police. And if there's any intervention, it's usually from other public authorities. Then there's like the second tier of this pyramid, which is more about signaling. So looking in police data, that's their role there, and sort of signal to other public institutions that something might be going wrong in families. Then safety and care is like, there's already like quite some signals that things are going wrong. And so the safety and care is not with the police, but it's more in a coordinated effort between public authorities. So it's no longer signaling, it's actually taking action. And then the part of where the police comes in, it's actually about managing crime. And I think why this pyramid of increasing complexity is quite important is because we often see these tools as sort of separate from their context. And within the Netherlands, this really has to do with this idea that there's a one government approach, so that people are falling between the cracks, people are allowed to sort of become like career criminals. And that all has to, like, part of it has to do with like a lack of coordination between public authorities. And so the top 600 is, I think, one of the first of these data-driven risk scoring programs. And unlike the UK, they're quite simple statistical modelings, actually. And the top 600 is what we call also persoonsgebonden aandacht, the PGA. And it basically looks, it's a person-driven approach. So, and this is based in Amsterdam. So the idea was that it was like a political response by the mayor and the city of Amsterdam, and the gang matrix was also a political response. I want to say against sort of the riots in 2011. So here it was a political response against sort of increased violent robberies of jewelries, where one also led to a homicide. And so the mayor said, we have to do something. We're currently seeing that our current interventions to prevent sort of this top 600 or these more hardcore high impact crime offenders or revolving door offenders, there's many ways in which they are described, are currently not being dissuaded from going into a life of crime and continue like repeating them. And they're actually responsible for the majority of these incidents. And what's interesting about this top 600 is that it's actually hosted in the city. So it's not a police initiative, it's hosted within the city. And it's collaborating with a number of public authorities, of which one is the police. But these lists are they are created on the basis of police data. And so here you actually see also this pyramid of increasing complexity again, where you see there's an interplay between, in their eyes, between sort of preventing crime through an approach of care and care and punishment, where they want to prevent certain crime from happening. So this is managing crime, but they also want to invest in changing the conditions of somebody's life. So they say, for instance, maybe they need more support of the Department of Mental Health. Maybe they need help with their debts. So it's a very broad program. It's not just police. It's really also about child protective services. It's about the city helping them sometimes relocate to a different neighborhood in the city. It's about sort of offering them job support. Like, it's a range of different interventions that all belong in this top 600, and the city of Amsterdam is responsible for it. And where actually data comes in is that they say we have about 15,000 high impact crime offenders. And then on the basis of sort of a number of criteria, which are very transparent on their website, we can like narrow it down to about 2,000 to 3,000 individuals. And then we run this against public prosecutors' data to actually increase the threshold where they say you have to be convicted of a crime before you actually can get on this list. So they're actually not only known offenders, but also known offenders that have been taken to court before. And so I'll leave it there for now. And then there's another one that's called ProKid -12 and ProKid -3. So what you see is that usually there's a number of these systems working alongside each other. The thing with ProKid is that it's actually not active at the moment. And it originally was developed to sort of see if they could identify kids under 12 in police data that show concerning behavior and refer them to other public authorities. And this referral is quite important because under 12, police have no jurisdiction. So it really belongs to the other public authorities. And so what they based it on was like recorded incidents and activities of minors. So for instance, if they got caught shoplifting or got fighting, there's like a range of sort of small activities, plus sort of the incidents and activities that happened on their house address. So it's really tied also to what happens in their home address and their family. And on the basis of this, they could sort of, they could create this list of children under 12 that show concerning behavior. And then they're actually now sort of pushing it towards, they're redeveloping it and identifying sort of young adolescents under 23 that show increasing worrying behavior. And that's also to sort of refer them to other public authorities, but because it's like over 12, it now becomes a question of where does police step in. And the difference with this model is that it actually completely ignores the home address, because after 12, apparently they say it's no longer interesting. It's not such a big factor anymore. What they could see from the police data, because this is all run on police data, is that actually the activities of their co-suspects. So if they were shoplifting with a friend, does their friend also have a criminal history? And so on the basis of this, they can also run lists of sort of children that show worrying behavior. And both of these are like, the top 600 is like, they run them every 6 months. And after the data processing has happened, they sit down together with like a coordination team of the different public authorities and sort of discuss every case individually to sort of see if they get on these specific PGA's, so these specific lists. And so I want to spend some time talking about the fundamental problems, because I feel like even though like there are mixed feelings about the top 600, because at sometimes we have to realize that these families are already engaging with many public authorities, and also this non-coordination between public authorities can create like a lot of like bad stuff for the families themselves. And some have actually said that it has helped them at times, because the person who's responsible for their case can call the police, for instance, and say to stop harassing them. And some have been helped with sort of like debt management, or like with moving to a different part of the city. So it's not all like negative. It's a bit contested, but I feel like what we have to understand when we talk about these predictive policing programs is that we have to question the role of the police and police data in any prevention and care activity. Because if we look at ProKid under 12, we see that sort of, even though the police say it's not their mandate, and they forward them to another public authority, it's still run on police data. And what's the role of police in prevention? And this is also something that police say themselves. They really are like questioning their own role in it. This has some historical connotations in the Netherlands as well. But we have to realize what Patrick said, like that data reflects historic and contemporary police priorities. So as soon as for instance, gang become a priority, all of a sudden young black men are clustered as sort of a gang member, and they get labeled in turn. But it also legitimizes these priorities again, because I've asked the police in the Netherlands why they run these risk scoring programs on high impact crime and not, for instance, on other types of crime like financial crime, or because I could tell you what these lists would look like if it was run on financial crime or embezzlement. It would have a very different profile of children on it. And they basically say they don't have enough data on it. So it's sort of like these priorities mean that that data gets collected, but it also means that it legitimizes again the use of all these algorithms on this type of crime. Then there's a lot of issues around accuracy of police data and sort of the legitimacy of interoperability, because using this, the data about this, of our Bureau of Statistics for policing purposes, I don't think people have realized that this is one of the things that's happening there. So what does this then mean? And one of the things I'm realizing when I'm now talking like to police about the use of technology is that there's a lot of referral to procedural safeguards, to data protection measures, things like this. So, but never is it the question if they should actually implement. It's only how and under what conditions. Whereas I would say that in some of these cases, they shouldn't actually be tested or shouldn't be implemented. And if it doesn't work, it also should not be happening because there's a lot of like other side effects. And sort of, I want to add also like who has access to this data, because in these cases, it's like homegrown tools. So they're developed by themselves, by the city of Amsterdam, by the police of Amsterdam, and by the city as well. But if you looked at the other list, there's a lot of like, especially in the UK, there's a lot of buying off the shelf. So it's like buying tools like predictive policing software. Do they have access to sort of crime data? What does that mean? I think we have to like challenge these things. And then if we talk to sort of like the people who are on these lists or the people who are like fighting for their rights, these lists are very stigmatizing. So they get a lot of, they get sort of, they get some things in return. So, but everybody in Amsterdam knows the top 600 list. It's not like, it's not the secret. Everybody knows that if you're on the top 600 list, you are a criminal. So they are very stigmatizing, and not just for the individual, but for the family. And this is, I feel, not taken into account. And then there's like violence in the first place to be reduced to a number. So how these lists work is that first on statistical basis, sort of we reduce people to a number and say like, if we just like play around with these variables a little bit, we can create a top list, like whether it's a top 2, a top 10, a top 600 list. And then we will look at these individual cases themselves. And I feel like if you've never been exposed to being reduced to a number, which most like people actually working on these issues have not, because there's quite a privilege in working in sort of like the data protection field or like the technology field. It's like being reduced to a number, there is violence in it. And while it sounds quite nice, the coordination between sort of the different public authorities, the challenge is really is that it only increases the asymmetric power relation, because instead of like, if something goes wrong, you as an individual are no longer fighting sort of one entity, which already can take forever and feel like immense. If now something goes wrong, you're actually fighting the full force of the state. So how are we building in safeguards and checks and balances if we actually agree on this program to protect sort of the individuals who are at the bottom of this asymmetric power relation? Because these interventions are preventative, so it never has to hold up in court. Yeah. And then I think the last 2 points before I'll give it back to Griff is that, let's see. I think the one thing that we never talk about either is that the people who are on these lists, for instance, they already have quite a lot of interaction and dependency on the state. They're usually dependent on the state for a whole wide of reasons. So maybe they get rent support, they get sort of health support, they get like all these different sort of things in the Netherlands that really makes you dependent on the state. But also being dependent on the state increases the risk of punitive action. And it's just one of the stories just kept on coming back, where sort of like some of these kids on these lists have a lot of problems. And so there was this story that was shared with me where one of these kids had a lot of problems, and it sort of created quite a volatile situation in their house. And the mom at times called the police to sort of intervene and to make sure to de-escalate the situation. And then later she realized that by calling the police for these sort of emergency situations, actually her child got put on the top 600 list. And that was felt like very unfair and punitive actions, because and as a result, she stopped actually calling the police to de-escalate the situation in the house. And I think this is the thing that nobody wants, because we want like emergency services to be accessible to all and not have a negative impact on like other things that are going on. And that's it. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Fieke. Just to say, please, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to send them in through the Q&A function. and we'll get to them at the end. We'd love to hear what you think. Any question, no question is a bad question. We'd like to hear your thoughts, your comments, your views. So we've now heard numerous examples and case studies, and very clearly a number of very serious structural and fundamental issues around the use of these systems in criminal justice systems. And given these extremely serious issues, it's clear that strong regulatory frameworks are needed to govern the use of AI and algorithmic and predictive systems in criminal justice decision making, and in some circumstances and uses to restrict their use entirely. And there has to be a strong European response to this rising issue. So on this, we're going to hear from Sarah Chander, Senior Policy Advisor at EDRi. Sarah leads EDRi's policy work on AI and non-discrimination with respect to digital rights. She also has experience in racial and social justice. Previously, she worked in advocacy at the European Network Against Racism, ENAR, on a wide range of topics, including anti-discrimination law and policy, intersectional justice, state racism, racial profiling, and police brutality. Sarah.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Griff, and thanks to Fieke and Patrick for your fantastic presentations. On the nature and the operation of predictive policing, and particularly its racialized impact, to be honest, I don't really have much to add. What I really would like to do in this intervention is just to supplement with some experiences, some learnings from the EU context, but also take us a little bit further into what Fieke already did, which is about, okay, so what is it that legally, but also in terms of a governance perspective, what would we do to contest these issues? The racialized surveillance aspect, but also much more broadly on the political economy of the deployment of many of these systems. How do we challenge these things? And by no means these are fully fledged answers, but perhaps maybe more questions, and would love to hear a little bit more from the participants in this chat to talk through some of this a little bit more. From the EU perspective, something we've been looking at a little bit more on the side of predictive policing systems or various other deployments of automated decision-making by law enforcement. We've also been looking more and more into the expansion, the development, and the increased push for interoperability between databases used for crime and immigration control, particularly at the EU level. This is happening in various degrees at national level. Fieke has alluded to some examples, but also in many other contexts, we've seen the expansion of such databases. At EU level, we're looking here at the PRIM database, but also the Eurodac database, which is around, which has been a little bit highlighted in the EU Migration Pact, which has just come up. Without going too much into the details of what these databases do, I think that it's also really necessary to supplement the conversation on predictive policing with a more general sort of look at how particularly institutions in the EU in particular, but this is also relevant to the national level, how we see an increased push for the expansion of these databases and how they provide the necessary infrastructure for predictive policing and other risk assessment technologies to operate. And I think that's a really important part of the sort of ecosystem of this growing network of law enforcement tools that we can see have huge implications for our privacy, but also more and more as we look into them more, we have to also be suspicious of the extent to which these over-target racialized communities and also migrants in Europe. This is I can talk a little bit more about how this is a very difficult conversation in the racial justice space, but I would really just to say that it's important that we sort of view the conversation on predictive policing in conjunction with the expansion and also push for interoperability of these databases. Both of them, the examples I mentioned, looking into them, the proposals are that they're already existing databases, but the proposals are to shift them from what were previously fingerprint or vehicle registration data to facial recognition data, which of course is a massive expansion and has of course different implications on what that means for the privacy of the people whose data is represented on those data sets, but also the sort of like slow function creep of these databases in terms of what crimes they were initially supposed to deal with versus what crimes they were proposed to be talking about now. So for example, PRIM, which is a database which looks at vehicle recognition data, has the push to expand it to facial recognition data, but also noting that previously it was developed or initiated to deal with serious crime and now moving into the area of petty crimes. And I think these sort of shifts, political shifts, are very much geared to a push that we see in general, which is that we should accept the notion that such databases should be expanded, law enforcement capacities, legal capacities, but also resource capacities should just be expanded at all costs without a proper democratic but also legalistic conversation of the implications of that on people and all types of people, not just assuming that this will impact all of us in the same way, but also the implications on our data protection rights too. So just maybe that as a caveat for the conversation on predictive policing, that also we're really thinking of the link between that and the mass expansion of existing databases, and how does that impact certain categories of people, noting what Patrick has already said about the pre-existing racialized conception of crime in general, but also petty crimes in particular. The conversation on migration is a whole nother aspect, knowing that by nature certain people are targeted by such moves, such expansion of powers of the state. And so what do we do then? What do we think about then, and how we contest some of that? I wanted also to give some inputs about the broader political climate and how it looks at the EU level contesting, or even just drawing concerns to things like predictive policing systems at the EU level. As I said, I think we see a wide range of discretion given to law enforcement with respect to all of these systems really, but also a general increased climate which is sort of pro increased capacity for law enforcement, and therefore coming with that pro increased data for law enforcement, and also therefore pro increased deployment of various types of systems, whether or not it's proved, as Fieke said, that they work or not for their intended purpose. There's a general climate in which we particularly see in the eyes of policymakers just generally should accept all of these things without proof that they actually work, that they're actually non-discriminatory, and that they benefit society as a whole. And I think that is a context in which what makes our advocacy really hard in this space. I think that also in the context of the upcoming regulation on AI, these sort of factors are really important to inform what we're talking about with respect to predictive policing, is that in the concept of, this is a generalized piece of legislation that is looking to come out, but there are some specificities when it comes to these dynamics in law enforcement that actually has a lot of presumptions of the benefits, whereas the risks are extremely, extremely high for certain individuals. But by the fact that people are coming to this conversation, we already can assume that they are sort of sympathetic to the fact that there is racialized policing in general. There is a concern that the application of these systems can exacerbate that. However, this level of understanding is not necessarily matched when you see a general policy conversation, which actually in general is in favor or accept the assumptions of traditional criminology and traditional law enforcement discourses. I'll finish with a few sort of reflections on some of the challenges of contesting predictive policing, but also some of these broader dynamics more broadly. When we look at some of the, when we've had conversations with policymakers when it comes to European Parliament, also European Commission, when we talk about predictive policing, there is a general assumption, which I think is quite interesting, that we have a very we should have a high level of alert when it comes to these sort of risk assessment, person-based predictive policing schemes that have been mentioned. But when it comes to the more place-based locational data, there's a much more acceptance that these things are generally okay. Maybe just a general investment in the fact that the notion that location can be a good indicator of crime, which I think many of us know the problems that relate to that, and both speakers have already explained that, so I won't break it down. But this general acceptance of this, I think, makes it much harder to challenge with policymakers why there should be higher restrictions on some of these things, and how we would actually safeguard people that feel the effects of over policing as a result of such systems. That is much harder to prove in conversation with policymakers on that issue. And I think it comes down to the highly individualistic nature with which we view the systems that can protect us from these things. So we view non-discrimination law, we view the GDPR as a tool to contest some of the harms that emanate from these systems. However, if it's not a question of an individual, identifiable individual on a particular database here, there, or anywhere, but rather a community level or a neighborhood level that feels the effects of these systems, then I think it's much harder to challenge them with respect to our existing legal frameworks. From this, I think, noting that we have actually we have actually had to question a little bit with the role, how can GDPR help us in this? Not to say that it's not useful, it's incredibly useful, but the question of how far do we also need to look to other existing frameworks to help us contest some of these systems, and the discriminatory role, particularly that these systems can pose, even with greater transparency about how much of these systems are used, where they are used, which is even in itself a hard win for many digital rights activists to win. Even when we know that these systems are being used, how to prove that they shouldn't be used on the basis of their racist or discriminatory impact is another question entirely, and engages sort of another sort of ongoing debate in racial justice sphere, which is the extent to which we would advocate for disaggregated data, racially disaggregated data, presuming that, for example, we know that the gangs matrix in the UK, because of a system of racial advocacy, which actually invested in the need to have disaggregated data, we knew that by looking at that system, that is disproportionately young Black men on that system. There's a question more and more when we speak to anti-racists about some of this stuff, is that how would we know that yes, for some systems, as Fieke has mentioned, we can indicate that actually that they had explicitly used nationality or migration data, but the other systems that don't use such proxies, which don't use such explicit reference to race or nationality, but rather use proxies, how do we challenge them? How do we show that disproportionate impact on certain racialized groups if we don't have that such data? Not suggesting that the absolute answer is data, of course, and for many such cases, we know that there's a discriminatory impact without necessarily having a percentage or a figure on that. But let's just say that this engages an ongoing conversation, which makes it a little bit tricky to say that there's a simple solution to some of these things. That engages the question of that maybe we might want to be less, especially for people in an advocacy space or in an activism space, that we might want to be a little bit more creative about how do we approach some of these issues. One being the child rights angle. So Patrick has already explained that yes, many of these systems do disproportionately target young ethnic minority kids, young racialized kids. And I think this is a really underplayed angle of it, the extent to which this number one, more generally impacts child welfare, but number two, how far do the rights of children and those frameworks relevant to that, are they engaged? And one last reflection that I'd really, I'd like to see if this is interesting to people, and also to sort of like engage the wider conversation is that one EU level response in general on AI is to tackling AI and the discriminatory impacts of it is always put forward as the debiasing of the data sets and the need to debias data sets. When it comes to predictive policing, I think many of us are sort of curious to know, what does it even mean to debias a data set used for predictive policing? Which, when we could argue, as has already been done, that all policing data, perhaps even the concept of crime and also the decisions about which crimes to focus resources on and not, all of those conversations are highly racialized. So what does it mean to debias the data set with respect to those considerations? And will that actually help some of the risks and the problems highlighted by all the speakers here today? It's with all of this in mind that we have actually pushed for that we do need to recognize collective impact of such technologies more and more. We can't just rely on only individualized frameworks to address some of these issues. Not to say that they're not relevant or important, they hugely are, but we also need to recognize that many of these engage collective, they engage communities, they engage neighborhoods, they engage racial groups in general, and how far can we look for solutions which engage this dynamic and understand the harms of various automated decision-making systems from this angle as well. And secondly, one thing that we really push for is that, yes, we know that there's a need for more safeguards. We know that there's a need for transparency when it comes to these systems, but we also need to not be shy to say that if we have a demonstrated racial impact, or if we have a core reason by which we can say a particular system or a particular type of technology is by nature incompatible with our human rights or fundamental rights, then it should be an option on the table that we should be willing to push forward to say, actually, such systems should be prohibited. And this is definitely a broader ethical and governance conversation that we need to engage in, but I think it's really important also to have this broader question of actually considering this enhanced power dynamic. Do we have opportunity for increased democratic oversight, and do we have opportunity actually to say no to the operation of some of these systems? And yeah, with that, I'll hand back to Griff.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think we've got some time to hear some questions, and I've got a couple to start with. I'd just like to put, considering the content of what was said. Just to start with, Sarah, I'd just like to ask if you could expand on something you touched upon. You mentioned as a solution to the issue of discrimination and the problem of in these predictive policing systems, the concept of debiasing data sets. For those who are part of this, who may not know exactly what that process is, could you just expand on that in a bit more detail?
To be honest, I would actually I am still trying to understand what this means myself. I would say it's a really hyped up recommendation that is often coming from a lot of policymakers that don't really engage necessarily with these systems themselves. And perhaps Fieke can maybe complement this answer, but there is often put forward in a policy circle the need for increasing the representativeness of certain data sets when it comes to various automated decision-making systems. And I think this argument really comes from the facial recognition debate. And if people haven't followed, there's many ways in which we can sort of contest this notion of facial recognition. One of the examples, and I think really dominated the debate on facial recognition, was that these systems disproportionately misidentify Black and brown women particularly, but Black and brown people in general. And one of the main reasons for doing so is because they're trained on highly biased data sets. They are highly disproportionately trained on white faces, right? So the technology in itself is not equipped to deal with certain people. by nature of how it has been trained, then the answer, if you view the problem with facial recognition as that, which I think many of us in this chat don't, and they'll see that the problem with facial recognition is actually more structural and deals with the fact that if we allow the deployment of this technology, and if we sort of succumb to it, then actually it will be used to further racialized over-policing and just general over-policing of society in general. That we know is our main problem. However, for many people, the answer is actually, let's just make this technology better. Let's make it better at identifying all faces. And therefore, one way of doing that is making the data set more representative, therefore having a more accurate sample, which understands that sort of like various different proportions of representation of society, and the data actually better aligns to that. With the question of how that links to predictive policing, I'm probably rather hear from Fieke than myself, who is much more of an expert on me. But for me, I really would like to know how it's being put as a general solution, and whether actually is that a good safeguard, or is that a good answer to predictive policing? Is it just that we need more representative data, or is that even what I've already said in my sort of intervention? What is representative data when it comes to crime data, when we know how that's gathered, we know what that's the result of? So yeah, I'd really like to know if what Fieke thinks about that.
Fieke, are you able to add to that? Don't want to put you on the spot, but
no worries. I mean, I think, well, first, I don't think predictive policing is seen as a solution. I think, like, if we actually look down on it, focus on it, you see that it's either like not being used or half being used. That doesn't mean it's not going to be used in the future, but I think we have to sort of also like stop feeding this narrative. But then we have to look at what the problems are. And I think, like, for me, maybe representative data within the predictive policing is not, I feel like we miss a step, because as like Patrick and Sarah said, like there is a racialization of crime. Like it is like choices, what crime we're applying it to and what crimes we're not applying it to. And I always feel like if we flip the narrative, are we then still comfortable with the actions taken upon it? So say we flip the narrative and say, like I said, we're going to use this on financial crime or like a white collar crime, then the demographics will be very different. It will be in different parts of like the country, also of the UK and the Netherlands, where different parts of the city where so there's these young adults at risk, or like these locations at risk of this crime happening, because it will be like at the banking district, it will be at the rich neighborhoods, things like this. And so I feel like, I think we have to flip it before we actually start talking about representative data and start questioning, like, if we apply it to a different type of crime, are we then still as society comfortable in using it? And then the answer is often no. So then why are we comfortable using it on high impact crime, which has a very specific demographic on it? And then the other thing that I find fascinating, especially when we look at risk scoring, is that we could also use this and look at sort of specific crime and see, could interventions of police, like which interventions have been successful, which interventions should be different, like not look at the perpetrators or the victims, but at the police intervention. And this is, to my knowledge, almost not happening. One, and two, people like police officers get very uncomfortable with it. And here is where I always think, like, if you're uncomfortable with it being applied to you, then you also have to realize it's very uncomfortable that it's applied to another. But somehow here, like, I feel like these are first two questions we should even start to answer before, like, we can apply it to any type of crime.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think from my knowledge and from what people, especially data scientists, have kind of written on this, is that there's ultimately no easy method to adjust historical data to rid it of bias. And even when identifiably biased data is removed from data sets or algorithms, it doesn't actually necessarily remove the bias, as of course, as has been mentioned, other variables can introduce that bias into the system by proxy, as Fieke mentioned, postcodes, and these postcodes can often be a proxy for race and socioeconomic status. There are ultimately so many opportunities for bias to be brought into these systems via historical data, whether that's criminal justice data or socioeconomic data, that it is unreasonable to say that it can be removed. I just wanted to focus on it because it is, as you said, Sarah, it's a policy solution that many who seem to think that they're in the know say as a kind of catch-all solution to these systems. Okay, we've had another question. It's a question for all participants. To what extent is the deployment of predictive policing systems being driven by the private sector? It would be interesting to know about the extent these systems are being actively marketed in Europe and how they're being marketed. Which any of you would like to go first?
I mean, I can say that I don't have any proof, but I know it's being marketed. It's like they are these tech and policing conferences where they promote everything, not just the predictive policing, but facial recognition, voice identification, any surveillance method, basically. So they are definitely being promoted. It's just that you don't have access to them, or I don't have access to these conferences.
If I can add to that as an example from the UK, there's a predictive policing system called Predpol, which is a geographic crime prediction system, which purports to do, as Fieke described with the CAS system, to be able to predict where crime will occur in particular areas in a city or a town or a particular area. And that was being quite aggressively marketed to police forces. And when police forces signed the contract to buy that system, they also had to agree to effectively take part in the marketing of the system. They had to agree to publicly say that the system was assisting in reducing or assisting them in reducing crime or assisting them in their kind of policing strategies. So that's a kind of very nefarious and aggressive marketing tactic that's being done by these types of private companies. Sorry, Patrick, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, looking back in an old world when I used to work in probation as a researcher, there were often tools being used as a way of trying to predict the likelihood of reconviction and the likelihood that an individual was going to become involved in offending behaviour. And this has gone back over a number of years now. So there's nothing new in that sense of wanting to try and identify who is risky and who is not risky. But I guess essentially I think in the work that we were doing, and I think if Eric was on here, he would speak to that there's almost a political impetus here as a way of trying to demonstrate that we're responding to those concerns and those harms that that members of the public feel. So the asylum seeker or violence or extremism and radicalisation and terrorism become the discourses around which individuals want solutions. And I guess within that environment and within that kind of situation, then private companies, but also academic institutions will step to the fore with a range of solutions to try and respond to these policing concerns. And as the presentations have demonstrated, some of them are problematic and may not be as effective as demonstrated. However, there is still a pursuit for such tech, and I guess for as long as we strive to be risk-free, then there'll be solutions to try and respond to those notions and constructs around risk.
Can I also add on the fun, like it's not just about the question of aggressive marketing by private companies, and I think that's a huge part of it, but as Fieke says, we know so little about that. But it's also a question of public funding and how public funding is allocated for some of this stuff, not related to only predictive policing, but for example, I was on another call earlier today where there's a researcher looking into technology for DNA profiling, which is being funded by Horizon 2020, so at the EU level. So a consortium of private actors and also academics, as Patrick has said, looking into possibilities of linking DNA profiling to sort of look at the ability to infer eye color, skin color, hair color from such from DNA in order to be used for law enforcement capabilities. And people involved in that, we know very little about that project, but people involved in it have been some of similar researchers that were engaged in the development of technology for the persecution of the Uyghurs in China. And so there's definitely a question about not just the private company aspect to that, but the whole sort of proliferation of actors engaged in incentivizing technologies for the purposes that, Patrick has already mentioned. So sort of also not alongside this marketing of it, but also creating solutions to already constructed societal problems that, have an implication if you are a member of a racialized group in Europe, because you are portrayed as that problem. So yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, another question. Someone's asking if we can hear a bit more about the pros and cons of disaggregated criminal justice data. That's something that I think that you touched on, Sarah, but just to give and explain it to anyone who doesn't know the kind of the full concept. The issue of kind of disaggregated criminal justice data is around the fact that in some countries, we're only able to know that these systems have discriminatory outcomes because the data which is collected in criminal justice systems disaggregates people by race or ethnicity, and sometimes nationality. And the fact is that we can see when analyzing the results that come out of these systems that they are discriminatory, but only when we have the full extent of this data. And for a number of kind of historical and legal reasons, in many countries in Europe, this data is not collected. So there is an argument to say that, and this is something that at Fair Trials we believe may be an answer, or at least should be a kind of a necessary requirement, that if you're going to try and use these systems, you have to be able to tell whether or not they are discriminatory, and you shouldn't be able to use them if you can't. And to be able to do that, you need data that is disaggregated by race or ethnicity. So it'd be great to hear from all of you, or any of you, what you think about the pros and cons of that argument.
Yeah, I'd really be interested to hear from others about that. From my perspective, like just from experience, it was a huge pillar of a lot of anti-racist work, at least like quite institutional anti-racist work, which is that, again, we need this proof. And we don't have it. And maybe in some other countries, even if we don't have necessarily like self-identificatory disaggregated data by race, we have maybe something equivalent collected by the state. So it's also like proxies for that, migration background or language or mother tongue is some sort of proxy for this. So you can sort of like understand the racial makeup of some of these databases, or the racial outcomes of some sort of services or interventions by using data that isn't necessarily disaggregated by race, but uses proxies. The issue with many of those things are, so you're looking at Sweden, you're looking at many other countries that won't collect race data, but they'll collect like migration background data, is that often these things are related to the nationality of the grandparent, or sometimes even the parent. So when it comes to third generation, you'll see these many people like white not reflected in that data at all. So that's a problem. But I think there's a broader issue of like, should we be pushing for that? Many like privacy questions, maybe questions of trust in police, which like many communities that if you work with on a grassroots level and you try to sort of like convince them of the argument you just made, Griff, there's still a huge lack of trust in institutions to sort of even get behind that argument. So there's this, but there's also a broader question of, to what extent do we always need, should we base our strategy for contesting these things on the availability of that data, when there are many other ways that we can do it? Should we actually be required to prove to a T that this discrimination exists because of this power asymmetry, because of the fact that actually perhaps we should shift the debate, and just like in discrimination law, we should maybe be able to indicate that there's potential for discrimination there, and then it's up to states to prove otherwise, I think it's probably a better system with this regard, particularly considering that in much of mainland Europe, you do have at a societal level, at a state level, sometimes even in some community levels, yeah, massive aversion to this notion of disaggregated data. So yeah, this isn't a very clear answer, but I don't think there's a very clear answer to this question. Intuitively, like as people that are researchers, we do want this proof, right? But whether that's realistic as something, a strategy to base sort of like contesting these technologies on an anti-racist basis for, I don't know, it will be a long time for any of these things to actually be successful. So maybe we shouldn't base our strategies on the existence of this specific.
You did a little freeze at the end there, Sarah. So I was just about to jump in, just in case we'd lost you. But I just want to echo much of what you've just said there in relation to that. It's an ongoing conversation. And given much of my work is concerned on the question of racial disparity across the criminal justice system in England and Wales, I'm often struck by the fact that across England and Wales, I can say that Black and brown people are 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. And in some parts of the country, they are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. And equally, I just cited figures that say 80% of people on the matrix in London are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. So I'm able to say that, and there's something quite important about presenting that argument. However, when we reflect on, for example, statistics on race in the criminal justice system, which is produced on a biannual basis and has been now for decades, the question of racism and discriminations that impact on minority ethnic communities still exist and persist. So individuals would argue, well, you have the data that demonstrates this injustice, and yet the injustice remains. So the question is, and I think you're right, is it simply a reliance on that data to demonstrate that there were discriminatory policing and law enforcement practices, or do we need to develop different strategies across Europe as a way of demonstrating that? And I think for some individuals, the conversation goes, if we're undertaking research at a local level, which demonstrates that the narratives and stories of people who are subjected to these data harms and these levels of policing, then that's a way as well in which we can communicate how these structural concerns are impacting at the individual level. And maybe what we shouldn't do is become reliant on the levels of encounters as recorded by the police in terms of stop and search, but how communities speak about their encounters with the police. But I agree, it's a fascinating conversation, one that's been ongoing for a long time, one which we grappled with in terms of the data-driven policing report, because again, in Europe, it's extremely difficult to get any data which speaks to race and ethnicity of individuals. And we're thinking through what are the alternative strategies in order to do that. So yeah, it'd be good to have that conversation in a bit more detail with you, Sarah and Fieke.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, because I feel like the reason why it's also not collected also has historical groundings in many countries, having to do with the Second World War. If I look at the Dutch context, for instance, because they used to collect it, but they don't collect it anymore. But I do feel like maybe it's also seeing opportunities that used to exist, but no longer exist. Because, for instance, in the Dutch context, we had the tap law. So it's basically the law about tapping phones. And then the Secret Service had to go in front of Parliament and at least once a year give statistics about this use. Why was it used? How? Sort of like they had to give some information about it. And on all of these systems, they don't have to give any statistics about it. It's not about the time it was used, which neighborhoods it was used, even who was stopped because of this, what were maybe their demographics, all of this stuff. You don't even have to think personal identifiable information of a person to be able to actually collect these statistics. And I feel like that is, I think in some countries that might be a more low-hanging fruit, in which you can already start showing that certain things are discriminatory because they only happen in certain neighborhoods, or how the argument went against the welfare risk scoring program, Siri in the Netherlands. They also didn't have statistical proof, but they had some form of that they could show that this was disproportionately impacted certain communities and not others. And I feel that will be an easier win than like collecting and publishing like data about police encounters with people.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I just want to ask one last question to try and give people a bit of hope before they leave, which is that what safeguards, what solutions, what do you think the answer is to these systems? If you think the answer is banning them or restricting their use, then please say so. Patrick, do you want to start us off?
Thank you for that, Griff, for throwing me in first to pick up on that large question. It's a tough one, isn't it? It's the idea of hope and what strategies. I come at this from a very different position. I'm not a digital rights individual, I'm not a surveillance expert. I've worked with a number of them now increasingly. I come from a more sociological, criminological background, and I'm anti-racist in my position. I guess the complex or the challenge for me, therefore, is that, and what I've struggled with recently is, for example, the gangs matrix in London was challenged by the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, because of the breaches in terms of data sharing. This wasn't a question of racialization and the over-policing of black and brown communities, but almost a technical concern around who should and who can have access to data. Now, what we've seen is 1,000 individuals have been taken off that database. But increasingly for me, the question is when we begin to couch these concerns and our concerns around privacy and the rights of individuals, they are often trumped by crime. So these individuals are violent, they pose a risk to our way of life, etc., becomes a discourse, and that always seems to trump questions around human rights. So there's part of me believes that until we really engage in the questions around anti-racism and discriminatory policing practices, which are historical in nature and which are structural in terms of its effects, then it's going to be really difficult for us to begin to move beyond. I can see technical solutions, I can see rights-based wins, as it were, but and I'm not going to end on a positive note, but until we begin to foreground racism and discrimination and the construction of imagined white communities, then it's going to be extremely difficult for us to begin to move beyond the tech and almost see these tools leveraged away from the police and law enforcement agencies. My apologies, but no apologies.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Fieke, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, maybe I also don't know if I end on a positive note, but I also see the issue about sort of like these procedural safeguards. I feel like they're like a lot of these things are relatively easy to overcome. And I'm not saying easy, like it takes a lot of work from them, but it's like, it's relatively easy to overcome. Whereas I feel like now, like the discussion we should have is like, what is it actually that we want from police in society? And if at any, does technology play a role in there? And also because it's like, what has shifted is that the state has far more intrusion in our private lives, whether that's like within sort of like encounters because there is more like dependency on them and there is like a bigger paper trail, but especially also because they can like read a lot of things like our social media, they can look at our phone records, like there's so much more intrusion that was even possible 20 years ago. And so like we can have this discussion about like safeguards and we can, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but it's like, and every individual system can be sued. And like there has been wins, like the facial recognition case by Liberty has been won. The Siri case in the Netherlands has been won. There's like some DPAs are doing some good work. So the ICO, but also the CNIL in France. But these are like individual wins. And I feel like to shift beyond that, we need to like, I don't know. It's not a technology problem, it's like a policing problem. And I feel like we keep on getting distracted by the technology because not only is it like easier to implement safeguards there, but it's also easier to like identify one individual things and then go after it. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Is a question that requires a panel in itself, but I think that we just have to be open to like a package of responses. Like, yes, definitely this is not like a problem of certain technologies, it's a problem of like much structural racism, like over policing, surveillance in our society, and these like are issues that have to be addressed at the root, definitely. I do think that there's like certain, I don't think it's certain technologies, but certain uses or purposes that certain systems have been deployed for, that there could definitely be more regulation on. And if time and time again there's a certain use that has a demonstrated racial impact, then I think that it needs to be an option on the table that they're highly curtailed, those uses. We're quite skeptical to call for that in a lot of civil society, and I don't think that's wrong, because I do think that there's a genuine interest in how like reforming such systems and putting safeguards in place and stuff like this. And I think that's good, but also we need to be ready to sort of like deploy a package of measures which will include these safeguards. For some uses of technology and law enforcement, there might be technical fixes, and others, yeah, as Fieke said, there needs to be an option to say that actually this is not okay, it's not legal, it's not morally it's not okay, and we should be able to contest that on the face of it. It's not easy to say a general answer for that, but I definitely think like it should be that we should have a full package of governance responses to these deployments.
Thank you very much. There's certainly a lot to think about from those responses, from those proposed solutions. And I have to say, I agree with the majority of what's been said. I think that the responses need to be, I actually do think the responses and solutions need to be much more aggressive, and we need to look at these structural issues much more aggressively before we start signing off on any of these kinds of technology in the criminal justice system. Thank you very much to all our panelists, to those attending. I'm sorry that we've slightly overrun. Thank you to Patrick, to Fieke, and to Sarah. For those of you who enjoyed today, we will be doing another one in a month's time, which will focus on the same types of systems, but in pretrial detention, sentencing, and probation. So please feel free to come to that. It will be a similar format, and look out for details on our social media. Thanks very much for attending, and see you all again.